Welcome to the show, Florian.
Thanks for having me.
You're an incredibly accomplished publisher of environmental psychology papers. How many papers have you published?
So far, I'm just short of 100.
Oh my goodness. So we might need to come back for, if you're open to it, like multiple podcast interviews, because I've yet to see somebody with so many papers. So we're probably only going to be able to scratch the surface in our time today. Just to start with the basics, what I like to ask people is, what is the problem that current sustainability professionals are living in when they don't understand environmental psychology, when they're trying to enact recycling programs and climate change programs and urban greening and pollution, and they've just never heard of the lens of the psychology and the behavioral science? What is the problem with being in the dark?
I think the generic idea is, are there any reasons, commitments, or dedications of humans that are critically important for what they do? This is basically the one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it, are there any rewards, incentives, stimulations we can use to promote pro-environmental behavior of any sort? So we have basically the question, is there a psychological silver bullet that makes people act in a certain way? Or is there some enforcement or stimulation that can be used to make people act more pro-environmentally?
It seems to be that there are often, you said a silver bullet, like there's low-hanging fruit around, that if we don't understand the psychology of humans, we might completely miss the low-hanging fruit that we can use to drive change while we're going over here looking at it in a perhaps a complicated or ineffective way when we're out in the field.
I'm afraid if you really want to change something quite dramatically, I'm afraid there are no low-hanging fruits. And there is a lot of talk about possibilities to do a little bit here and a little bit there. But I think if you just want to do a little bit, it will result in only small effects.
I wanted to ask you what you thought of the biggest mistakes that you see governments and not-for-profits and sustainability managers making when you're watching campaigns being rolled out around the world.
I think that the biggest mistake is, of course, at the core of my research program, in my view. People try to stimulate singular behaviors. And that there is nothing wrong about promoting singular behaviors, but it will not eventually change people's mental setup to act more sustainably in a general way. You need to change lifestyles, not individual behaviors. You have to make people more dedicated to environmental sustainability, which basically implies they will actually act in multiple ways more sustainably. And I think it's a common misunderstanding even among environmental psychologists that we simply can start with one behavior at the piece and then roll up everything on and on.
Right. So what you're saying is, if you just look at individual behaviors, the cumulative environmentally friendly behaviors don't necessarily lead to a completely sustainable society,
Right.
Which makes sense, right? And I think a lot of people do understand that. But then if some people are just looking at individual behaviors, that they might not completely drop. The penny might drop about the complexity that's involved in changing the entire system.
Right. But there is even a technical term in the literature in environmental psychology that describes basically such a change in lifestyle, which is called behavioral spillover. So if you want to make a whole array of behaviors change, then of course you have to stimulate such a behavior spillover effect.
Right. I have a question about that later on, but I'm going to try and go through my questions sequentially because there's so much to cover with you and your research. So now, how I found you was by your recent publication on financial incentives promoting green behavior. Now, it's a common thought with people that they think that humans are 100% motivated by money. All of our motivations come through making it expensive or fining people. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, what's the problem when we see money as the only tool in our toolbox for making change happen?
The downside of money is, apart from all the obvious things that it costs money to actually spend it, you have to control for not misusing or getting the incentive for nothing in return. There is obviously the one aspect, it is not lasting and it will not change people's minds. It will actually cease to exist after you stop supporting it financially. So if you take back the reward, people will fall back in their old behavior pattern. That's the biggest downside. So if you could, in other words, money is always an extrinsic additional enforcement, but it is not something that will change people's intrinsic inclination to do more for the environment.
So what your recent paper showed was that when you gave people financial incentive to do environmentally behavior, which was getting people to order more vegetarian meals, when you took the financial incentive away, the behavior went back to normal, except with the group that had already a pro-environmental attitude. So it was really the environmental attitude that created the ongoing behavior, not the financial incentive. The financial incentives wear off as soon as you take them away, right?
Right. And just a small correction in your summary of the findings. What we find is, independent of the intrinsic existing motivation of people, money has an on-top effect. So people, even when they are highly motivated, they do a bit more of it when they are rewarded. And so regardless of the environmental attitude, they actually are stimulated to do more by the financial reward. But when the financial reward falls back, people fall back on their own old behavior. So what we find then in the end is that the attitude effect is still existent. So people with a higher pro-environmental motivation engage in more vegetarian meals, regardless of whether there is an incentive or not. And this is basically the baseline performance level.
Right. And can you explain the difference between what extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is? So the type of people that listen to this podcast are sustainability professionals like me, environmental engineers, environmental scientists, and most of us don't know anything about the field of environmental or behavioral psychology. So can you explain it and how this relates to giving people financial incentives to go green?
Right. Maybe just a first remark on it, because there is, of course, a theory within psychology that claims basically the term intrinsic and extrinsic. I'm not referring to this traditional theoretical approach. I use the term intrinsic and extrinsic more in a colloquial terminology. People do it out of their own interest. They do it even when they are not rewarded. And so extrinsic would be something I haven't thought about doing it or not doing it, but I seize an opportunity because somebody gives me some reward. That would be some extrinsic, basically, behavior. And in this case, we rewarded our students for eating vegetarian meals by giving them an extra buck. That was per meal. If, to begin with, these students were already having a certain inclination to eat vegetarian dishes. And this inherent inclination to eat something, to do something, that's what I'm referring to as intrinsically motivation. It's basically the baseline intrinsic propensity to do something. So
right,
if you have a...
sorry, go on.
So if you have a certain propensity to play soccer or football or basketball, that is basically the baseline frequency or your inherent motivation to do so per week, if you just look at the hours.
Right. So from what I can understand in the context of this intrinsic versus extrinsic theory of design, our intrinsic motivations are like core to our worldview and our identity and what we want, even if nobody gives us an award or a prize or a financial incentive. But then when you add the extrinsic motivators, like in your example, it was some money, or it could be some other like token, it'll enhance, it'll like puff up your naturally intrinsic motivation, as opposed to seeing them as completely like opposite ways of motivating people.
Right. Right. And you know that's one way of how things could be, but things could be actually even a bit more complicated. So it could actually be that if people are already intrinsically motivated, only these people responded to rewards. They seized the extra motivation basically, and the others wouldn't, which is basically what we call a moderation effect or a dependency effect. So that dependent on the existing motivation, the reward falls on fertile soil, or it does not. And so that's a possibility. And so this so-called conjoint interaction or moderation effect is not what we found, just to say one thing. And to coming back to the intrinsic motivation, this is basically just a more colloquial way to talk about attitudes. If you think about it, what an attitude is a technical term in psychology, but what it means basically is that there are certain things we are favoring, which is we aim to achieve certain goals. So if you have a pro-environmental attitude, basically your goal is to protect the environment, the climate and the environment. And you can say you have a certain dedication to that particular goal. And this is basically your inherent motivation to do something for the environment. So I'm trying to use more colloquial terms like reasons and commitment and dedication simply to express this inherent motivation to aim for certain goals.
And can you explain what your research is on the Campbell effect? Can you define what the Campbell effect is?
So what we have developed over the last 20 years, and basically that's why my publications are not worth reading through. You need to read 100 publications, because it's basically the whole thing about the development of the Campbell paradigm. And the idea is very simple, actually. It says that any manifest behavior that you see from people has two sources. One source is a personal reason or your commitment to a goal. And the other source is the behavioral costs that are basically obstructions to the behavior. So sometimes it needs exertion, it needs additional money, it needs attention, or it's bothersome, inconvenient in any way, which we summarize under the generic term of behavior costs.
Right. So from what I understood, you've got these two things going on together with trying to get anybody to do anything. You've got their attitude, which is how much they're just interested in doing environmental behavior. And then you've got the cost, which is basically how hard it is to do. So if somebody's like really got really high attitude, high agency, they're really into it, they will be able to overcome the really big barriers. These are the people that never use any plastic for like a whole year or ride their bike in the rain because they've got super high attitude. But then if you remove some of those behaviors and make it easy for everybody, then you can bring on a whole lot more people that maybe will only do it when it's very easy or when it's natural for them to do that. I just copied this description of costs of a behavior just to help explain what this is. It says behavioral costs include everything that makes a behavior objectively more or less demanding. Things such as effort, time, financial costs, but also social norms and expectations. I thought it was really interesting that you brought in the social norms and expectations, because when people think of a cost, they normally think of just really practical things like, oh, it's like annoying or it's hard or it's expensive. Can you just explain a bit more about what the social norms and expectations are in terms of a cost to a behavior?
Think about a situation like in California where you have recycling regimes. So every week you have your recycling bins on your sidewalk, and there is a collection company that picks it up. Your neighbors see it all times, and you know that your neighbors see whether you have your recycling bins out up front. So that's an interesting situation because it puts everyone under surveillance of other people, which makes it an almost, you could say it's not a manifest social norm in a sense that you can actually really observe it, but you can be aware of it without this surveillance. There wouldn't be an extra pressure on everyone. And this is what I meant with, it's basically hard under these conditions not to recycle anything.
Right, but then you have, sorry, then I see what you mean. So you also have the opposite happening in some communities. Well, like I remember when using reusable bags and reusable coffee cups was really strange. And when I was a teenager, if you brought your canvas reusable bag to the supermarket, it was really embarrassing because you were like the only one who have done it. And the lady at the checkout was like, oh my God, you have like a canvas bag. And I palpably remember the first time I brought a reusable coffee cup to a coffee shop, and I had to apologize and be like, well, I'm just doing a little experiment in trying to use less waste. And I'm sorry, it's weird. I've cleaned it. I promise it's not dirty. So there was a very, very strong social norm that it was something that was not done. People do it all the time now. So to break through that, you have to have be very highly motivated to break through our social norms because they're so entrenched in our behavior that we'll
exactly. And people know how to deal with it. Do they give you a refund for not using a paper cup? This is something in the beginning people didn't know at the cashier whether they should give you a refund after the company had to come up with a policy first, what to do with people bring their cups.
Right, and this...
Yes, I'm sorry. This is just a good example to demonstrate that social norms in a society actually influences the likelihood that certain behaviors occur or not.
And what I noticed that was interesting about your research what I felt really stood out about your research was this a war of standing up for the attitude, the intrinsic environmental attitudes filtering through to the behavior as one worldview, and another worldview, which is that education and environmental concern are quite separate from people's behavior. People can be super outraged about climate change, really care about the trees and the whales. And then if the behavior design around them isn't really done right, it just doesn't really get through. And so that's what I understand called the value action gap. Even though we have the values, we don't do anything. And that's something I talk about a lot, is the value action gap, and that we need better behavior design. But it seems like your research is saying that the value action gap isn't as true as people might make it out to be, that environmental values and education and concern really is a big part of creating the attitude that leads into the behavior.
Right. Actually, that was part of my starting point, seeing that there is some oddity in the idea that people would not act upon their inherent interests and reasons. So if somebody says, maybe saying, if somebody is really holding environmental protection in extremely high regard, it would be such a surprise if he or she wouldn't do anything. And if you just simply changed a little bit of your notion, why does this idea of an attitude behavior gap occur? Because many of my colleagues actually equate a verbal statement like, I find environmental protection important, with an attitude. But in my understanding, a verbal statement is just a verbal statement. So, and if you really want to understand the dedication to a particular goal like environmental protection, you have to have a careful look at what people do in the way to reach that particular goal. Do they recycle paper? Do they actually say, yes, it's important something to do? Do they also refrain from using a car? Do they also actually commute by bike? Do they also refrain from using meat? So it's not only how much costs in a single behavior they overcome or ignore, it's basically how many costs on the way to protecting the environment they overcome. And from these behaviors, we can actually identify the extent of motivation or dedication to the goal. So it's a true latent concept, and it's not encapsulated in a verbal expression.
Right. And I see that that when you have people with these deeper intrinsic motivations, you've always got this playoff between say if somebody's got out of 10, how high their attitude is, in the ratio of like how hard it is to implement this stuff in the real world. Because there are many scenarios of people that I think have very high environmental values and still just like haven't gotten around to doing some of the stuff, like putting on solar or switching across to an EV, or perhaps getting more engaged in their community politics. And when I think about it through your lens of the Campbell effect, I think, well, you know what, it's actually pretty difficult to put on solar. I've tried to do it for 2 different houses and it's really confusing. And I mean, I didn't own the house. I was doing it for people I was living with, getting all these quotes, trying to convince them you have to get a contract with the bank. And I was like, well, yeah, sure, their motivation was pretty high, but like the process is really sucky and really complicated. And like, of course it's hard. It's hard for anybody to get through that and making that big financial commitment. Right. So perhaps the onus is then on the solar industry to make it a bit easier. Or maybe it just is, it's just a building project. There's no way to make it easier than it is. Mm-hmm. So when I was thinking through this concept yesterday, I thought, okay, well, environmental attitude does matter. It does it is a powerful underpinning of people's behavior. So if we're going to be, so we're thinking in terms of designing programs, we've got the behavior design, we've got some extrinsic awards that we can work with and some gamification, as well as this deeper mind space. So does this mean that when we're designing programs and trying to affect people, we really should be considering a really deep psychological shift that's outside of like, how do we like almost like hack? There's these terms like hacker, like behavior hacker, gamification hacker. These like, well, let's give people like a smiley face or a sticker when they do this. I mean, would you be a proponent of trying to have like deeply salient experiences where people have almost like a spiritual shift in that they make this connection to try and get their attitude up?
Your question aims at the question on how to change basically an attitude. And so far, I can only report that we have one study in which we have found an attitude change that has demonstrated a behavior spillover. We have one study out in which we demonstrate what an attitude change implies with 2 cross-sectional samples. So with groups of people from the same German state, 10 years apart. And in these 10 years, we could actually demonstrate that the environmental attitude changed, and we can demonstrate as well what the consequences are, that there is a generic behavior spillover that we can actually demonstrate with the numbers. But we have made a follow-up study, which we are about to get out, in which some colleagues in Great Britain have tried real hard to change people's environmental attitudes together with a large sales company. And they were successful according to our analysis of their data. And so we have basically found that an experimentally induced attitude change resulted in a change of multiple behaviors, as we would have predicted. And the change in the behaviors was in a very systematic way. So considering also the relative difficulties of the behaviors as well. But what was interesting is this was a highly strenuous endeavor. So it required not only incentives, education, visits, educational group sessions of the participants. It really needed 2 years to change people's attitudes in a certain way. So I hardly believe that one reawakening, that's not the right term, right? When you wake up people again.
Oh, you mean like you're reawakening? Yeah, I think we can say that.
Okay, I don't think a reawakening experience in a forest will do the job if you want to change an attitude, because people's commitments to goals are something very hardwired in people's minds, in my view. And so it's a really demanding job. So if you want to change, people first should decide, what do you want to change? Do you want to change a behavior, or do you want to change a lifestyle? If you want to change a lifestyle, it's hard work.
I see. So in terms of, I mean, when I first asked you about low-hanging fruit, you said there's probably it's difficult to change anything. But so if we're just looking at very specific behaviors, there could be an easier, cheaper, faster way to do it. If we just want to, we're like, okay, people are littering, right? Like littering, we've got to, and then we can use some easier, perhaps call it behavior hacks or gamification hacks. But if you want to change the deeper intrinsic sense of self and our worldview and how we connect to anything, that's really hard to shift someone's like deep inner world concept. So it's powerful, but it's challenging. You know what, we did, the next episode that's coming out is with a really interesting woman called Naomi from Magic Leap. Do you know Magic Leap? They make the augmented reality glasses. So they're like a little movie screen that sits right over your eyes. And then you can see like a video game experience superimposed over the real world. It's a really fascinating technology. And what we were talking about was that with the Magic Leap experience, the augmented reality experience, you can create a highly salient, immersive experience in a way that is far more, penetrates you more deeply as a person than you could see just watching your laptop, or even just seeing like a documentary. Even though a movie or a documentary can be very moving, there's something about seeing it in 3 dimensions. So you could have like a watch pollution or glaciers or extinction or utopian eco-cities of a vision of the future. And we were talking about the extra psychological salience of having an augmented reality experience. So it seems like from this conversation, there could be potential for us to get more serious and get more creative about these, trying to create these like deeper experiences for people. But you're saying it's like really hard work and really expensive to do that.
Yeah, and you are still you are also referring to worldviews. I don't think we should go so deep into philosophical notions about worldviews. It's really something, a quantitative extent. I think most people are to a certain extent ready to protect the environment. So the goal of environmental protection is probably something that I would say exists to some extent in almost any person. The question is how to raise the level, the aspiration level to a new position. And raising the aspiration level is simply a quantitative, not a qualitative shift. And even this quantitative shift is unbelievably hard to do because it costs effort along the way. And I think my starting example was usually the commitment to do a first marathon run next year. So if you first just focus on this one singular goal, you have to convince a person to run a marathon next year. And because this person, if she or he agrees, then has to go in all sorts of planning. How do I get there? How do I get fit enough for the endurance? How do I dress up? How do I actually learn the right behavior on the road? What should I do about pacing, and when do I start with workouts? How much should I do? How long should I work out? All the things that come with it. That's basically more closer to the aspiration change that we have. When you convince a person to run a marathon, that's a qualitative step. And then actually saying, okay, now let's start with a 5K and then end up with a marathon. That's basically only a quantitative step.
Right. So we have to get people to make that qualitative shift first to take on now I don't know what to say in terms of worldview now that you said you don't want to frame it in terms of worldview, but take on the aspiration. I think that's the word you use, right? The aspiration. And then yes, after you've adopted the aspiration, then you can drill down into the more like specific behaviors? Like one is the umbrella and then, or the parent and the child. Would that be a good way to think about it?
The, the behavior is basically like a staircase. If people engage in highly demanding behaviors, you usually assume, or you can expect, that they also engage in the less demanding ones, that all are relevant for a particular goal. And so an attitude is generally referring to a whole array of behaviors. We call it a behavior set. And these behaviors can be seen as the means to reach a particular goal. So if people engage in a lot of means to attain a particular goal, then we speak of a dedicated person. So similar, and the sports example, if somebody is dedicated to running, he or she will engage in a lot of activities to actually do the running or increasing the performance on track or on the road.
Right. And so how can we bring this down into like a practical framework we can use in the field? So one of my questions is, if you could design a gold standard for sustainability program design that people working in utilities, in governments, in not-for-profits could follow, I mean, how would you break this into exercises or processes that we could all start using in our job?
That is the trickiest question, is because how to change attitudes. And I do admit that we don't have enough knowledge at the moment how to change attitudes. What I have as a program would be, as Paul Stern suggests, look at important behaviors that have a big bang effect on the environment. And look how difficult they are, and then try to find out to make them less demanding for most people. So you can accept that attitudes are on a certain level. You can say every population has a certain distribution in their dedication to environmental protection. And you can take this dedication as the benchmark you have to take to consider whatever you do. And then you can actually see from all the behaviors that are relevant in a given society, which are the behaviors that would bring me the biggest environmental impact gains. So for instance, bringing up in North America, bringing people away from their individual cars, that would be a major step. So the simplest solution would be, we need alternative modes of transportation, which is not so easy to achieve in this particular example. If you want to have communities more walkable, then use basically the urban sprawl. These are all methods and suggestions that are already well known in architecture, as you might know better than I do, actually. This is, of course, a possibility. Or if you are in an organization like in a university, you look at possible behaviors that people do, and where you could say that's the search for the low-hanging fruits, where you can do a simple structural change and make it more easy for everyone. That's like paying my students for vegetarian meals. You can actually reduce the price for vegetarian meals in your cafeteria. That will have a certain effect, right? But it will not change people's minds to a way that they are acting generically more sustainable.
Right, right. So yeah, first is looking for the big bang for the buck. But then when you are looking at attitude, it sounds like, well, from what you said, nobody knows exactly how to do it. You had some interesting research about children developing environmental attitudes and the relationship between mothers sharing that environmental attitude. Can you talk a bit more about your research with children?
This was so explorations of several sorts. And one exploration was, of course, related with nature experience. And there was an interesting idea that people who live close to nature would actually develop also a certain appreciation for nature. And then with this appreciation for nature, they would actually get into a higher attitude to protect the environment. So if you enjoy nature, it seems relatively plausible that you are also ready to do something for your natural environment when it's threatened in any way. So this was the hypothesis we were exploring. And indeed, this is not very strong evidence that we had. Of course, what we found is the vicinity to woods and greenery would be beneficial, but only if you really go there. So it's not the absolute distance, but if parents wouldn't go into the woods, that people would not develop any appreciation for the natural environment. That was one aspect. And the idea was then followed up with research where we tried to find out whether we can actually pinpoint a causal relationship between appreciation for nature to environmental protection motivation or environmental attitude. And what we found is we have a relatively strong positive correlation between the two, but which is relatively stable with adults. So we had a 2-year longitudinal study, and we found basically no changes, no cross influences. At the moment, I still hold the opinion that we could probably also stimulate environmental protection motivation with people who enjoy using forests, nature environments, but the evidence is not strong, not yet. But I still would try to search there.
Because it seems to be, well, I get a sense that people's environmental values come more from their social context rather than from their proximity to nature, because I've met plenty of people that grow up in the countryside and near mountains and don't have any environmental values whatsoever. And there's people that have brought up in the suburbs, and it seems to be more of your social demographic, that you've been raised in a certain type of political environment with a certain type of values, a certain socioeconomic level, that you have the time and the space to be able to think about bigger world issues, that you're not as worried about the trauma or life difficulties getting in the way. And they say, I heard someone say once that believing in climate change has much more to do with your postcode than it does to do with your education about how many parts per million are in the atmosphere. So I think it makes sense to me that proximity to nature or spending time in nature would not necessarily correlate with your environmental values. But what I did see interesting, though, was that it said that the environmental values go from mother to child. And so if there is a really strong causal mechanism from mother to child, perhaps we should be empowering women, and maybe it happens from teacher to child as well, really empowering mothers and empowering maybe fathers too, and teachers to help transfer the knowledge to the child. I mean, when I think about where my environmental values came from, I don't think they started from a concern from nature, but they came from, my family was a post-war German immigrants. They'd just come out of the Second World War and landed in Australia with no money, very poor, couldn't speak the language. There was all Australians weren't very friendly towards Germans settling in Australia. So they had a really hard time. And there was an intense resource scarcity going on. And so my mother grew up in that, and I grew up in that, where everything was saved. Every light bulb was switched off. The tap was always turned off. Every scrap of fabric was saved. $1 might as well have been like $1,000. It was like gold. You had to save it. And this intense obsession with not wasting energy and not wasting anything. And so I would get in trouble. Leaving a light on or leaving the heater on was just like we'd get yelled at. There was such intense obsession with not wasting anything. And then in combination to that, we grew up on a beautiful property where there's a lot of wonderful nature around us. And I just think that that focus on saving everything combined with being in the nature just really cemented in this concept that you just have to not waste anything. And what didn't come from a concern for the planet. It was just a family structure of just being very, very aware of resource intensity that then naturally grew into the more like modern sustainability movement that we have now. But well, the point I'm getting to is that should we really be looking at this causal mechanism between parent to child and teacher to child as a really like hotbed of change that we could be investing more energy into?
Yes. But the transfer is not so easy to understand, because I would assume it depends a lot on the personal situation of the two. So the relationship they actually have. So if you are close with someone you admire, you deeply love, and of course what he or she says is more important to you than what other people tell you, of course. But the question is not so much what values we hold. It's actually how strongly we set certain values as our personal goals. That's exactly coming back to an attitude.
Personal goal. That's what I'm really getting out of this.
Yes, because having a frugal life is a personal goal, or leading a frugal life is a personal goal. And the aspiration that looks very similar on the outside as leading a sustainable life in many ways. But it's not the same goal. And one of the problems, coming back to the attitude behavior gap, is also a misconception about behavior. That even if we observe a manifest behavior, like riding a bike, we often understand this as having one single significance. It's a means to do something for the environment, which is not true. Riding a bike is also a means to do something for your health. Riding a bike is also a means to save money. Riding a bike is also a way to get rid of your work stress, working home after your hours at the office. So riding a bike can be a means to multiple ends. So if we want to understand why a person commutes by bike, then we should not simply focus on environmental attitude, because there were multiple attitudes that actually could make people ride bikes. So to put it in a different way is that sometimes psychologists are too focused on their singular concept when they want to understand particular behaviors, rather than understanding that behavior is multifunctional. And so we can attain with a single behavior multiple goals. And at the same time, if we want to assess the extent of a goal, we have to look at multiple behaviors. And this, if we fail to do that, we basically come up with the multi-times reported attitude behavior gap.
Right. So there's like a big goal out there that people want to aspire to, which could be like a healthy, happy, sustainable life, being a good person with a community or whatever or that's like a big life goal. But there's an overarching goal, and then the attitude will help us get to the goal, prime us to get to the goal, and then it's what will filter down from that is the individual behaviors. But I think that idea of a goal is really important to center on, because I talk about that a lot in my book, that you need just basically a measurable goal, which might sound really obvious, but you'd be amazed how many not-for-profits And people working on social impact startups don't have a measurable goal of like, well, we want to get like 20% carbon reduced. They're just like, oh, we want to create change, just this nebulous change thing. And when you reduce it into numbers, they haven't gone that far in their thinking. It's amazingly prevalent. And then also just being able to visualize, like just simply being able to visualize where you want to go in terms of an aspiration is quite a different headspace to being focused on the negativity of the environment. If you're just thinking, oh, things are bad, there's terrible things happening in the world, that's quite a different headspace to thinking, here's a goal that I want to achieve of a sustainable future, or what the person I am in that. So it's a very different lens, and it can filter down into communications, into the way a program comes out, going through that goal-centric.
That's right. And I totally agree. As an organization, it's important to make these goals explicit. But we as human beings, I'm not sure I would actually agree with you that we have one final ultimate goal on top. My personal view of it is we have multiple goals simultaneously and in parallel. And all these goals struggle for our attention. And I'm not referring to a very conscious attention. So they are just behind the scenes struggle for the steering wheel, basically. And then if they are in control, we follow their lead. And so it depends a little bit on the strength of each of these goals, how long they stay in command. And so that's basically more, we can actually measure these goals probably better than that people know the extent of their goals. And that's why the question, how much are you actually interested in protecting the environment, is so misleading, because it gives the false illusion that people can really reflect on the goals. And I think if we observe what people do, we can much better recognize how dedicated they are to their multiple goals.
Mm. Oh, can you explain the spillover effect, which I think is connected to that, right? I've read it so many times in the papers, but I feel like I don't understand it properly, and I don't think many people have heard of it.
So let's say a person who wants to really lead a sustainable life. So what we can expect from this person is that she or he just engaged in multiple behaviors that will lead to that life. So if somebody is really committed, he or she overcomes a lot of behavioral costs, engages in a lot of environmental protective behaviors of all sorts. So if somebody is less dedicated, then of course there is only one single behavior or two that he makes a compromise. He or she might recycle some paper or glass, but that's it, that should do it. So if we are successful in increasing these two persons' dedication to the environmental protection goal, we would actually find that on both levels, people would engage more intensely and in more behaviors, would overcome more costs. And that would be a behavioral spillover effect, because every single behavior along the way to protect the environment would become a little bit more likely. So you have basically, if you define people's dedication to environmental protection as the engagement likelihoods of behaviors of a certain class. So the commitment to health would be in the engagement likelihoods of health protecting behaviors. So, and the dedication to environmental protection will be the likelihood to engage in all sorts of environmental protective behaviors. So, and if you are successful in raising the attitude, then every single of these behaviors will become a little bit more likely. So you would have a cumulative behavior effect or a general behavior effect. That's what behavior spillover actually is.
Right. So if I can convince somebody to come out to like a vegan restaurant with me, somebody who is, it's totally novel to them. They've never thought about being vegetarian. They're not from that world. And they're like, ooh, weird vegetarian restaurant. And I'm like, okay, we're going to do this. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. And then they just take this very small step of eating this food. Then as other prompts are out there in the environment, like switching to an EV or using less plastic or writing a letter to a senator or whatever, that they're going to be more likely to do all those other things from this one thing they engage in.
This is an idea that some colleagues have about behavior spillover, that one behavior would act, it's like a domino effect. I make them do one behavior that is more pro-environmental, and then all kinds of other pro-environmental behavior would follow, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it would work. Because
but isn't that the spillover?
No,
isn't what I just said the spillover effect?
What you describe is basically a domino effect. You are saying if somebody can be pulled in to do one pro-environmental behavior, he or she might actually find out that, oh, now I've done this, maybe I should this as well. And if I do this, maybe I should this as well. So basically you are actually pulling, domino is a game you are familiar with, right?
Oh yeah, domino effect. So the domino effect is not the spillover effect.
Some actually in the literature argue that this might be a spillover effect and this can occur. To my knowledge, there is not much empirical evidence for this spillover effect. What we have demonstrated is that you have a spillover effect if you can change people's dedication to environmental protection. You find that all kinds of behavior show this increased likelihood.
Right. So it's a little bit more subtle is what you're saying. It's a bit more subtle and it comes more from an attitudinal place in the person rather than it's just like random, just dominoes going everywhere of like behaviors that just happen randomly.
Yes, because it's very systematic, because that spillover occurs, of course, also in reflecting the relative difficulties of the behavior. So the gains at the low end with almost no costs and at the high end with extreme costs, the gains are much smaller there than in the midsections where moderate costs are involved. So, and you can actually model that.
Right. And how is this different to foot in the door technique?
The foot in the door.
We need a glossary. I'm actually putting together all of these phrases into a glossary and I want to do a blog post on it. So I might need to ask you for another call to go through the glossary, help me out with the glossary of terms. So, okay, foot in the door technique, spillover effect, and dominoes. How is foot in the door technique different?
Okay. Foot in the door technique comes also from attitude research originally. And basically, the idea says that people are afraid to not acting consistently. And you could say it's a hypocrisy aversion.
Interesting,
so,
right.
If somebody recognizes that you do something for the environment and you know that somebody recognizes you, and the same person asks you then to support something else that is for the environment, it would be inconsistent in your eyes and in your knowledge of the eyes of your observer not to consent to the second request aiming for the same goal. And there is a lot of research by Bob Cialdini who uses this consistency techniques as a means to stimulate basically people's engagement or tendency to do certain things. And foot in the door functions very simply by saying, look, you come and visit a person, you ask for a small favor. Like, for instance, signing a petition to do something for the environment. A week later, the same person comes back and rings at the door and says, oh, you remember I came here to ask you for your signature for the petition. Now I have the opportunity that you can spend $50 for an environmental organization. Would you be willing to sign? So, and what the literature says is that people who consent to the smaller request will more likely also consent to the higher request later on, out of this fear to be hypocrites if they wouldn't. That's one interpretation of the effect.
Right. So it comes from a desire to have a consistent narrative of yourself. I mean, I just saw it as like warming up. Like I didn't really think about it as any more than that. But I think the foot in the door is really interesting because you'd probably have noticed this as well. There's a section of pro-environmental people who almost despise small changes. And I personally don't think that that's healthy for our movement at all. But I think the idea of going, for example, like meat-free Monday, like I hate the idea of meat-free Monday because we need to really be eradicating all animal agriculture now. And the idea, and they really don't even like the idea of behavioral psychology or behavior change because they think that if you're even thinking about getting an individual person to do an action, you're not radically changing society in every way. But I think it fundamentally misses the point that you need to scale people up on whether you're looking at trying to get governments to adopt big changes or people to adopt individual changes. You've got the way I see it is like levels in a game. You've got 1 to 10 and we all start at level 1 and then we have to jump up to level 10, which could be people that are able to make enormous changes in their society. And the trick to getting people on that scale of moving them up to being better advocates and citizens in all way is to just give people tiny little samples to start, and everybody's on a different continuum. So you've got to give people these little hooks. I mean, do you see it that way as well, that we need to just be like giving people these tiny little hooks to get them in and not to despise or criticize small changes because they're getting people on the elevator of bigger changes?
Look, I have another example that I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the political system in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there are a lot of referenda. So the populace can decide on certain policies and courses of action of the government. And I think in California, you have a similar system as well, right? Okay.
You mean it's like, individual people can vote on small ordinances in their local government?
Yes.
We do have that. Yeah. When you vote for I think it's the federal election, there's all these pages of all these local ordinances and they're really confusing. There's like 50 of them and they say, would you vote on this for homeless people and that? And I didn't actually know what to put on any of them. So I was quite embarrassed when I had to vote.
And in the Swiss system, you have regularly these votes on certain political issues. And just recently, there was actually a CO2 tax on the list, and it got turned down. So the majority of people were not in favor of a CO2 tax, which is, in my view, a quite effective means for a more sustainable society. And in Germany, we have a project right now going on in which we actually try to appreciate the extent of acceptance of CO2 tax among the population. And what we found out is that only about 1/3 would support a CO2 tax. So the problem is that the government has now to reduce basically the price per ton carbon. So it's a very low price, which basically says the measure is not highly effective. Some people say it's almost ineffective. So now I'm coming back to your question. Is it worth introducing this carbon tax? Not. But in the long run, I don't think in democratic societies we can actually do something else and try to increase slowly but steadily the environmental attitude of people, that they are willing to take more and more severe measures that bring us basically this change to the better.
Right. So environmental groups should be going for an ineffective, easy to introduce, foot in the door carbon tax, just as get the foot in the door, make it not upsetting to anybody. So instead of getting it rejected, they can actually get it through. Everyone's accustomed to this very, very small carbon tax. It's not really going to make an impact on CO2, but with the plan of being able to ratchet that up, rather than just going to something that's like very difficult to achieve, which gets, I mean, carbon taxes get rejected all over the world by governments all the time. I mean, this is probably one of the most effective ways to get carbon down, is to price it. And we just politically cannot get it through, despite everybody wanting to fix climate change. So you're saying we've got a foot in the door technique, all of these carbon taxes.
It's actually a misuse of the foot in the door technique. But I would actually say if it's about structural changes like a carbon tax, I would say aim low. Better having such a structural change implemented than not. And then the effective way of using it might come later.
Right. I just think that's such an important thing to understand for people that are very deeply passionate, deep green advocates that can be very negative and thingy towards. Thingy is a word we use. I don't know if you use that. Very thingy about small changes. One thing I also wanted to ask you is, what is the general ecological behavior scale?
The short answer is environmental attitude. Because I started my research by a totally different question than what I ended up with. I was puzzled that people could talk about pro-environmental behavior, but they couldn't actually come up with a scale to measure pro-environmental behavior.
Out of 10, like I get like a 7.5 out of 10, is it like that?
Just if you say recycling, less using a car, recycling paper, glass, spending for environmental organization, voting for politicians with a green record, all these behaviors that people can sum up easily. And they call it pro-environmental behavior or environmental protective behaviors. So behaviors that aim at environmental protection, so to speak. So we can easily come up with a list. But if we try to actually map them on a single scale, on a single dimension, psychologists failed. So, and this was my starting problem. So can I actually come up with a measure that I can bring all these behaviors on a single map, on a single dimension, and in the end then assigning every individual person one number for the extent of their environmental performance?
Right. But do you think we really need to be bringing all of the behaviors together into one environmental behavior score, or are you better off, because they can be very different, like your relationship between waste and cars and electricity? And I think the psychology can be different. Is it better to just not try to put them together, but to just look at like energy just by itself? Like electricity is just its own behavior, and maybe our relationship with green space is just its own thing, and not trying to mix it.
I don't think we should be careful not to confuse things. So one thing is the behavior, and the other thing is the ecological footprint, the consequences from behavior. And I think we should first, what we need to understand first is, are there any personal reasons, coming back to your original question, what is basically the issue in environmental psychology? Are there any personal reasons relevant for people's pro-environmental activities? So if we want to answer this question, we have to actually find the criterion pro-environmental activities and say, look, this is pro-environmental activities, and that's how we understand them. So it's not enough to say they correlate. We have to say they are basically exchangeable to some extent. It doesn't matter in our research whether we explore recycling or whether we research less car use. So then we are actually in one field, and we can compare results from different behavioral research paths. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. that's why this formal requirement is absolutely important. We have to actually, and one explanation is, of course, it could be that different reasons are responsible for different behaviors. Then if it's not possible actually to map them on one single scale, that would basically imply we have to study each separate of these groups of behavior individually to understand what to do, what leverage we use. And so I thought it's more parsimonious just to start with the idea, let's say when we have a word for it, we can map it on one dimension. And that's where it all started. And I thought, or my first idea was, maybe we ignore costs in psychology, behavioral costs. And so what I came up with is a scale that actually considers not only a parameter for people's overall engagement in environmental protection, but also a parameter of the relative costs of each specific behavior. And so we could actually find out people's commitment to environmental protection by simply considering the behavioral costs that come with it. And so the general ecological behavior scale is basically the measure that I invented, which I now call the measure for environmental attitude.
Can we download it somewhere? Can we see it?
Sure.
Is it on the internet?
Yeah, the GB is on my homepage. In the margin area, you can actually download the questionnaires. I don't know in how many languages already there. We have an R script, multiple things that are accessible. Even the original article, which publishes the items that we still use.
Right. I'll add it into the blog post when I write this up. But it does, I see what you mean. Even though environmental behaviors can be quite different in their environment, like your drivers for eating less meat could be quite different to your relationship with energy or with cars. They do seem to come in a basket together, that if you kind of into one, you're into the set. You can't imagine people like, here's my Hummer and I'm just like burning fuel all the time and I like hate everybody who's different to me, but I'm like really into being vegan. Like usually they do come as a cluster of biospheric values that people like live throughout their life and often in their job as well, in their profession and the way they conduct themselves in society.
Right. And it becomes really philosophical here because there is an interesting notion in behavior research, which came up by also Paul Stern brought this up. And in parallel, I have actually had a very similar idea. If you use an adjective with the term behavior, like saying green behavior, or health behavior. Why do you call a behavior a health behavior or a green behavior?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Why do I let me think about it. Why would I call it a health behavior? Or, I mean, I do know, I just don't know how to answer the question. I don't know how to put it into words.
So then let me help you. Usually there are two possibilities, because the consequences of a behavior are helping your health status to improve, right, or are beneficial for the environment. Then it's got right, pro-environmental, the
behavior. Outcome, like what happens
exactly.
in the outcome. Yeah.
Exactly. Then you focus on the outcome. And that's a very typical way to define pro-environmental behavior. But as a psychologist, you should be very careful. As a psychologist, there is a second possibility why you can actually call a behavior a pro-environmental or a pro-health behavior. Because people have used this behavior to attain a goal. So I drive my car to my local Green Party meeting to protect the environment, and car use becomes an environment protective behavior. So if we implement behaviors for a particular goal, We use also a definition, and Paul Stern calls this intent definition of behavior. If we have a certain intent with a behavior to attain a particular goal, then it comes as a means for an end. And William James, one of the founding fathers of psychology, actually made a claim that basically goal-directed behavior is at the core of what psychologists can do in behavior research. We can explain goal-directed behavior, not behavior with a particular consequence. We can only actually explain behavior that has a certain reason. And now we come back to my notion of attitudes. If behavior has a reason, we have to link it basically with goals.
Right, I see. So you're really like going into this like fine qualitative differentiation between a goal and a consequence as terms of the motivator. Like, so if I'm like, one thing I need to do is get rid of my petroleum engine car and get an EV or go car free. That's in my thing to do in the next month. So I can go about this in terms of a consequence, which is net carbon dioxide. That's the consequence. That's one way to be potentially motivating me to do it, or the way I could be thinking about it. But the other way is a goal and an attitudinal. And so when I think about my goal, I think I want to be just a good person, like a better citizen. Like I'm just reflecting on how I would feel. Like I don't feel good. I don't like my car right now, and it doesn't fit with my identity, and I don't want it in my life. So I am wanting to achieve an identity and a sense of moral integrity with who I am as an environmentally conscious, clean living person. So that's my goal. And so the way this comes down into actually like, how do we implement this stuff in programs that are going to affect thousands or millions of people? If you're designing a system, if you're designing it through the lens of telling people the consequences of CO2 all the time, consequences of air pollution, consequences of CO2, you're not going to be sending a very powerful narrative to, if you're sending people the goal of, this is the person you want to become, this is the lifestyle you want, this is your own moral integrity, the responsible person. I read another paper called The Responsible Person Approach, which just in my own conversations I've noticed with people is very strong. They want to feel that they're a responsible person. That goal for people, illustrating that goal, join us on this goal, is going to be a much more powerful narrative to tap into people than just the simple environmental consequences way of communicating.
Exactly. That way you are actually aiming for their reasons that control a lot of behaviors. And so you are aiming for their attitudes, basically.
Right. Yeah, that's really deep. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. That's really cool. That actually segues into my next question, which is one of my last questions. But I noticed one study that you've done on smart meters. Now, I've done a lot of work in smart meters. People hire me as a user interface designer, and I design interfaces to get people to save energy. I have a startup doing that. Really into feedback loops, fascinated by feedback loops of data. It's mainly what I do. But your study said that largely smart meters don't work unless people have this deeper intrinsic attitude, right? So from what I saw about that, it's that we can't just show people the data just on its own. We need to have both working together. We need to have the environmental attitude, the intrinsic motivations, and the smart meter to work. I mean, is that what you found from that study? You need both happening together?
Yes, that's what was basically what we found. I was already pointing out that we have to find a difference we have to see a difference, that there is a possibility to explain behavior, and there is a possibility to explain the consequences of behavior. And I think that's what we try to do with the little figure that we have depicted in this article, where you have, if you want to understand why people actually have smart meters, you can actually look at the cost of smart meter and their motivation for environmental protection. That could explain why someone has a smart meter. If you have a full rollout, then of course this wouldn't explain anything because there were no costs. Everybody has it. So the question is, would a full rollout of smart meter result in any savings? And what we found is the way people, how dedicated they engage in an activity. So it's not about a behavior, it's the investment into the behavior that matters. And the investment into a behavior in smart metering means I have to regularly check. I have to think about possibilities to save energy and I shouldn't get bored doing it and repeating it over the next year, maybe about 2, and see whether this really results in an effect. So it's a highly costly behavior. So if you really want to see savings, then you should actually see the savings as the result of the behavior, a smart meter, on checking on the smart meter, and the motivation of the intrinsic motivation of that person. Only if people are already quite motivated, you will actually find the saving results that you hope for.
Interesting. And I think what I've got from this conversation, the big message I've got from talking to you is that I see it a little bit like a Russian dolls. Like you've got the intrinsic, deeper attitudinal motivation at the core of the person, which is expensive and difficult to manifest in people, but highly worthwhile. And then you can wrap another Russian doll on the outside, which is the behavioral prompts or removing obstacles to people. And then perhaps just more layers of making it perhaps more fun and more exciting. But we need to have this core system of attitude and motivation going on, and then all the others are just like layers of enhancements on the top of that, which is quite a different lens to just hack the behavior, just give people a smiley face. Let's not really worry that they really are intrinsically embedded together, like a trunk of a tree with all of its rings. Do you think that I've summarized it well?
Very well. That's exactly the point. That's why I'm so concerned about the talk about the attitude behavior gap. I think the most important concept we have, especially when we want to actually improve the world, make it a more sustainable place, is actually the attitude people hold and harbor. And we have to promote, and we as psychologists should not ignore actually how to promote this attitude. Rather the contrary, we should learn as much as we can how to promote attitudes, the core, as you call it.
And do you think, I often talk about this crisis of causality we have with environmental change, that I feel like very few people, if anyone, has the causal mechanism worked out. People are blaming, they're like, it's the government's fault, it's greed, it's capitalism, it's the patriarchy, it's corporations. And it doesn't seem to be, no matter how intelligent or educated or perhaps high up someone is in the organization, I don't know if anybody, regardless of your experience and your education, has a better concept of the causality of how to make environmental change happen than just like a random person on the street. I mean, Rosa, what do you think when I talk about that concept of crisis of causality, and what do you think the causal, I mean, perhaps you've already explained it over and over again already today, the causal mechanism, but do you think that causal mechanism is just attitude and obstacle, like the Campbell effect, or is there any more, have you got any more thoughts about that?
It is actually, our behavior model is that simple. There are 2 determinants of behavior. So our causal model is that simple. We have an extent of a reason, and we have behavioral costs. And the extent of the reason must at least match the costs. Otherwise, the behavior will not occur. But as I said, this would explain when goal-directed behavior occurs. That says, I had understood that some people are strongly enough motivated to protect the environment with this particular behavior. But there are a lot of people that are strong enough motivated out of another reason to do this particular behavior. And this is, of course, another model. So if you want to understand bike riding, you better not only look at environmental attitudes, you should also look at health attitudes and frugality and other attitudes as well. And only then you will understand bike riding in its entirety.
Right. So you don't think it's greed, capitalism, the patriarchy and selfishness that are the cornerstones of all of our problems?
These are all generic sociological post hoc explanations of societal change, culprits of any sort, with make it an empirical question. And I think I cannot recognize there an explanation that I regard anything other than an interpretation and finding a generic culprit of it.
Yeah, I find a lot of people want to find that what you call a generic culprit. People want to be like, well, it's because of this desire to want to simplify it into this, like it's just greed, it's because people aren't educated enough. And I just think there's so much more nuance, and often it's unglamorous. Like I ask the question to everybody on this podcast, and sometimes they're just like, it's just habits. Like we're just used to things, and there's no big boogeyman here that you can find, and like there's the evil guy.
Another famous one is alienation from nature. I don't believe that any of these simple explanations actually account for the whole mess we are in. It's a little bit complicated. People are complicated. Behavior models can be extremely simple, but we are a lot of people with different reasons to act.
Well, this is why I'm doing the podcast, talking to people like you to try and like peel out this big web of reasoning, because a lot of the time working in sustainability, people just don't know how to change. That's why the podcast is called How to Change the World, not What We Need to Do, because a lot of people, we know that we need more trees and more solar panels and to change the structure of freeways. But I mean, we're all really stuck on the how. Like, okay, you want to get 80% less CO2? Everybody working in this space is like, oh my God, how do we actually get like all of this stuff to happen? And I don't think we can get through this how unless we're really deeply understanding the psychology of people to make it happen.
I had a book chapter with my doctoral student on the issue, and in the end we concluded with something similar I mentioned earlier, by just saying we have to promote people, to bring them in a situation that they are willing. We have to promote this intrinsic motivation so that they are willing to accept harsher and harsher institutional means to bring us to a better society, to an improved society. So without a more motivated populace for this environmental protection goal, I think our politicians will not be able to have very restrictive measures in place that will help us as a society to move in the right direction.
Right. So yeah, that's a critical point of like how individual behaviors and attitudes will ultimately lead or be a foot in the door to really big institutional changes, that they will help us there. Okay, so just last questions to wrap us up for today. This is what I like to ask everybody at the end. So imagine in 100 years, you could have any future happen in regards to your research and passions around this space. What would be your best case outcome for your world of where environmental psychology would be at in the world?
That my theory would be heard and people actually learn, and we would learn that how to stimulate attitudes and promote attitudes. And I think that would be an interesting new world, although I can also envision some risks if we will be able to meddle around people's reasons. It can easily be misused by very powerful, not so democratic societies and powerful people. So it's like with every powerful approach, it is also open for misuse. So I'm not only hopeful, I'm also a little bit concerned if my theory gets used and fully understood. And we learned indeed how to change, and in these people's dedications to various goals, we have actually learned a lot as psychologists, but we also have learned a very dangerous message.
Although I think the bad side of the force has already had a really good run on the planet. There've been a lot of corporations pushing and people that design roads and freeways and fast food that have already had a really good run. So I think it wouldn't be so bad if the environmental psychologists managed to hack in to people's attitude and behavior and got to have some time in the sun fixing all of that. And just to close up, what are you most excited about your research coming up?
Actually, what I find fascinating is after building a solid foundation in theory and in measurement, the theory got a life of its own. It's now more than 20 years that I basically study the same phenomenon, and sometimes it changed labels and terms, and I learned actually more what it implied. And now we are coming back and looking at psychological theories with this knowledge that we have gained, and coming back and realizing that probably some of the theories in the textbooks are not exactly accurate, and there might be simpler or other ways to explain certain findings in literature. So for me, what excites me still is that empirical research can actually be something like a path that you follow up when you discover new turns, new corners, new territories. And it's amazing for me that every time when I feel that something is now for me answered, there is a new question coming up, and we go in a new direction.
Right. And it truly is. Environmental psychology is a fascinating space. I'm still a beginner, and I think most people listening are also beginners. So we're very delighted to be able to learn from people like you, follow in your footsteps, and have you take the lead and find more of these new eddies to research. It's been a delight to uncover and dive into all these topics. There's been a lot that we've covered today. And thank you so much for joining me today, Florian.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.